Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So this is the afternoon session of our retreat at the Cascade Hermitage on Ānāpānasati, or Mindfulness of Breathing. And the past once again, we'll be doing these retreats at the end of every month, the last weekend. And the last few talks, we moved through the first 10 steps of the Ānāpānasati Sutta. So for those who don't know, the Mindfulness of Breathing Sutta is 16 steps divided usually into 4 tetrads, or groups of 4. And the groups correspond to each foundation of mindfulness. So the first 4 are related to mindfulness of the body, the second 4 to mindfulness of feelings, the third 4 to mindfulness of mind, and the fourth 4 to mindfulness of dhammas, or roughly Dhamma categories, the ways that we classify our experience in terms of positive and negative mental qualities to be cultivated or abandoned, depending. And I thought this is sort of our last chance to kind of speak a bit, and I had such a good time actually talking with everyone last time that I thought, maybe to make this talk a bit shorter, and then we'll have time to actually speak a bit, which would be nice. But what I did hope to do was, for the sake of completeness, to move a bit through those final 16 or so steps, 6 or so steps. So for those just watching this video or joining us, it may be worth going back to some of the previous talks from the previous day on the steps of mindfulness of breathing. The first 4 relate to noting the length of the breath, and just because this is a good chance to speak to one other overlay onto this sutta. The Ānāpānasati Sutta overlays with the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and then there's a rough overlay and resonance with the description of the 4 jhanas and also the analogies of the 4 jhanas. There's another overlay. It's a very hyperlinked text, and it's astounding the implications you can tease out through this. Another overlay is the 7 factors of awakening. So at the beginning of the sutta, the Buddha says that one who brings these 16 steps to culmination develops the 4 foundations of mindfulness. One who develops these 4 foundations of mindfulness brings the 7 factors of awakening to culmination. One who brings these 7 factors of awakening to culmination realizes true knowledge and deliverance. So the sutta can take us all the way to awakening. And the 7 factors of awakening are these beautiful positive mental qualities. I know that I've mentioned this before, but the DSM, I think it was the DSM-4, had 1,900 and I think 99 pages, a nice round number, dedicated to mental illness and mental defects, and then 1 page, I believe, dedicated to sort of positive mental qualities and mental health. The DSM-5 did slightly better, and they had about 150 pages dedicated to positive qualities. And this is one of the great gifts that Buddhism can give to the West, is a very robust understanding and articulation of positive mental qualities, of mental health, in a sense not just of lack of neurosis, but actual extreme well-being of a nature and caliber that I think we have yet to really understand as a culture. And I usually reference this in tandem with this, but Freud famously said in the interpretation of dreams that the best he could do was transform your neurotic misery into normal human unhappiness. So Buddhism is aiming to give us a different standard of what the mind can become. The 7 factors of awakening are perhaps the most succinct but also complete list that the Buddha gives of these positive mental qualities. So it's mindfulness, investigation of dhammas, so investigation of experience, virya, which is energy or effort, piti, P-I-T-I, which is variously translated as rapture or refreshment, which we've spoken of a bit. Then there's passaddhi, which is, it corresponds somewhat to sukha or pleasure, but it's a tranquility of body, and it's very somatic. It's based in the body, and it's very still. And then samadhi, or unification of mind, and then upekkha, or equanimity or equipoise. So the beginning of the sutta directs one to set their body erect and bring mindfulness to the fore. So this is the establishment of mindfulness, the first. The first 2 steps, which deal with noting breathing in short, one knows, I breathe in short, breathing out short, one knows, I breathe in out short. And similarly with long breaths. We spoke about how this is an opportunity to manipulate the breath to make it more comfortable, and also to tether the mind very concretely to an object which allows one to anchor one's attention at the beginning of experience. This is also the development of the second factor of awakening, of analysis of qualities. So one is carefully analyzing the breath. This leads to the second and third steps, which are one breathes in and out, sensitive to the whole body, and breathes in and out, calming the bodily activity. And in previous talks, I spoke about how that corresponds and has been a step that's been the subject of a much debate. But as I understand it, the most effective way of approaching those steps, and the one that I think that the Buddha was speaking to, was to look at the development of sensitivity to the whole body as really a development of a wide field of awareness, which allows one to become sensitive to the subtle flow of energies, pana in Pali, usually along at least one major circuit around the body, which is the meridians up the spine and down the front of the body, or up the front of the body and down the spine. As one becomes sensitive to that flow of energy and keeps one's field of awareness wide, although one also is simultaneously developing an increasingly subtle sensitivity to the sensation of the breath at one point where it's most prominent, say the nose, and trying to keep that continuous, but also maintaining a wide field of awareness in the periphery, or focusing on that wide field of awareness of the body, but always keeping the breath in the periphery, but always kind of balancing these two. And so moving from the step of knowing the length of the breath to becoming aware of the whole body is a very conscious stepping into a mode of training, because every step after the first 2 involve this word sikati, which means to train. And so one is applying effort and really looking at one's experience in an active way. And the first moment where that happens is when one consciously expands awareness to encompass the whole body. And we spoke of a lot of ways of sort of doing that with skillful means, like using visualizations to visualize light coursing down through the crown of the head into the body, or bringing awareness into the torso in various other ways. But with that step and every subsequent 14 steps, the refrain of the sutta remains. one trains thus, I breathe in, blank, blank, blank. I breathe out, blank, blank, blank. So the breath is always there in the periphery. And this is the development of the third factor of awakening, of effort, because one always makes the effort to have the breath in the periphery. You're always balancing. And sometimes I find the mind really wants to sort of coalesce onto an object. Say one becomes sensitive to this flow of energy up the spine and down the front, and it feels nourishing and refreshing. It's okay to let the mind fall into that for a little bit. It's going to want to, because it's such a refreshing moment. And if one is constantly like, no, I also have to keep the breath in mind every single moment, it can be a little much. At the same time, you don't want to let the breath go that long, because then you've given up the cause of these more subtle sensations, like the breath energy, like these brighter states, which are really truly grounded in that breath. You've given that up to focus completely on the more subtle and delicate fruit of that focus on the breath, which is ultimately dependent on that focus. And Ajahn Jeff compares it to stepping off scaffolding into clouds. So you've let go of the breath and you're completely immersed in whatever the other object is. And if that happens, you'll find the other object may start to dry up quite quickly. So you always have to keep the breath there in the background. And that's the enlightenment factor of effort, of virya, is always keeping the breath there. This leads to calming the bodily activity, which we spoke of yesterday, which is where as you become sensitive to that subtle energy flowing through the body, the sort of coarse ways we force the breath through the body, like expanding and contracting the lungs, become more and more unnecessary, and the breath becomes subtler. So just letting, in that case, that movement of the body calm, and just becoming more and more sensitive to just the flow of the breath. And that's the calming of the bodily activity. And as that coarse physical activity calms, then this sensation of energy and rapture, of piti, or refreshment as it's called, moving through the body and refreshing it, becomes extremely prominent. And this is the fifth step of one breathes in and out, sensitive to refreshment, to piti. It also is the fourth enlightenment factor of refreshment, or piti. And after that's happened for a time, usually the body, like a sponge that's just soaked up all that water, will become still and satiated, and just rest in a much more still and tranquil pleasure. And that's passaddhi. The step of the sutta it's associated with is the sixth step of one breathes in and out sensitive to pleasure, sukha. But it corresponds to the enlightenment factor, the fifth, of passaddhi, which is tranquility of body and sort of a deep pleasure. It's a correlate. And I like to point out that this is frequently when that sort of sign of light will manifest for people, or it's also seems to correlate roughly to the state the Buddha spoke of when he gave the analogy of the third jhana of lotuses immersed in cool water and just pervaded by that cool water. But the water is completely still. There's no movement. And as that still backdrop becomes prominent, and frequently another sign becomes prominent, like the sign of light or the sound of silence, then it's as if the backdrop of the mind becomes very visible, and all the play of perceptions and feelings and images which usually occupy our minds become very distinct and coarse on top of that smooth white backdrop. And so they become very visible, which leads us to the next steps of becoming sensitive to mental activity and then calming mental activity. And it's almost as if that canvas of white, one sees the calligraphy on top of it and then lets that calligraphy fade until you're just left with the pure white canvas, luminous, still. And that backdrop maybe could be compared to the mind, or at least mindfulness of mind, a much broader scope. And this leads us very easily into the third tetrad, steps 9 through 12. These steps are parallel and overlay the mindfulness of mind foundation of mindfulness. So you've sort of moved on to a much more refined area of experience. And the first step in this tetrad is one breathes in and out, training thus: I will breathe in and out sensitive to the mind. The next step is I will breathe in and out gladdening the mind, and then concentrating the mind, and then liberating the mind. So my sense is that when one comes to that sort of still white field of awareness a bit more, or a much more still awareness, that's becoming sensitive to the mind. The shapes and mental proliferations and thoughts and their accompanying physical patterns that manifest in the body have really been relaxed a lot. And you're just kind of left with a sort of blank space a bit more. And this can be disorienting for people because we're so used to populating our mental landscape and orienting ourselves with perceptions and thoughts, even when they're subconscious, to the point that we don't realize what we're doing. So it can feel a bit like stepping into a void, which is why the next step is so useful. Not only does one work through that by really bringing a very continuous awareness to one's object of the breath at the nose, accompanied by that wide field of awareness, simultaneous. But the next step, 11, of gladdening the mind, pamoja, pamodayang, is where it's as if you take that white canvas and you drop a piece or a drop of golden dye onto it, and it, because the mind is so primed for it and smooth, then the golden dye pervades the whole landscape of the mind very quickly. And I know in Eat, Pray, Love, which I love, like it's a great book by Elizabeth Gilbert. I can only kind of do like 2 of those, but it's like the thing Elizabeth Gilbert points to in one of her retreats is they use different language because she's part of a yogic tradition, but she says that the void became a doorway. And I've always thought there's a parallel here. It's as if you encounter a void, but then you invite something into it, say a word of metta or a recollection of loving kindness. And suddenly you realize there's this huge brightness comes welling right out of it. And the whole strata becomes infused with this levity and brightness. And this is gladdening the mind, which leads then to the next step of concentrating the mind. And Ajahn Pasano always says this. He says, we have it all backwards. We think that once we have samadhi or concentration, then we'll be happy. But it's actually that once we're happy, then we're able to get concentration. So once the mind has been brightened like this, say you encounter that still space and then you bring metta to it just a little bit, and it responds beautifully, then your mind and heart are much more willing to trust that state because it's so bright and they want to absorb into it. It's not a problem. So that's where the mind can become much more concentrated, much more easily, which corresponds to the sixth enlightenment factor of concentration. And the next step is one breathes in and out, liberating the mind. And this can be interpreted a few ways. One is just to look at it as the culmination of the whole of the path and liberating the mind to enlightenment. Another way to look at it, though, is to apply that progression of this third tetrad to every earlier step. So whatever step one is on, one becomes sensitive to how the mind feels following whatever the object is, say the breath, or say being conscious of the whole body. So one becomes sensitive to the mind. And then one gladdens the mind. One really absorbs into that object and watches as it brightens the mind state, because it will, little by little. Then one concentrates the mind on that object and really absorbs into it. So say one really feels that subtle breath energy running up the spine and down the front of the body and really immerses in it. This is the mind concentrating. And then there comes a point where the mind becomes subtle enough that it no longer wants to remain with that object. It wants to move, even to more refined states. And that's liberating the mind. One liberates it from its previous object and reaches up to the next rung of the ladder. So one can apply that third tetrad of the mind to every one of the previous steps as a process one goes through each time, gauging where one's mind is at and using that litmus test to decide if one wants to move on to a more refined and stable state in those steps. Everyone sticking with me so far? I know it's a lot. I want to give you guys the landscape before this is the last talk, so it's a lot, but we're almost there, and then at least there's something to play with. So the final tetrad, steps 13 through 16, are and that can also apply to the seventh. That step of liberating the mind could also correlate perhaps to that seventh enlightenment factor of equanimity. One is releasing. The fourth tetrad corresponds to the fourth foundation of mindfulness. So mindfulness of dhammas, or dhamma categories, which in the suttas has recently been pared down. In the Pali Canon, it appears as like a huge list of different ways of parsing out one's experience. The 5 hindrances, the 7 enlightenment factors, the khandhas, the sense bases. But a comparative study by Bhante Analayo between the Chinese and the Pali texts has revealed that originally it really just was the 5 hindrances, which are the negative mind states that keep one from becoming calm, and the 7 enlightenment factors, which you've spoken of, the bright states that bring one towards awakening. So it makes it much simpler. It's just looking at one's experience in these two frameworks. And so this fourth tetrad moves through the following instructions. One trains thus: I will breathe in and out, contemplating impermanence. I will breathe in and out, contemplating dispassion. I will breathe in and out, contemplating cessation. I will breathe in and out, contemplating relinquishment. So there's a lot there. What a beautiful image I've heard around it is, or used to describe this process, is by Bhante Analayo. And first of all, if one has work skillfully with those first 12 steps, then the mind is calm. And once it's been calm for a while, it begins to move. And when it moves, that's the chance to apply that power that the mind will have gained to contemplate things in one's life. So the most powerful object, if one feels up to it, is to contemplate the body, the physical body. Our attachment to the physical form is so deep that we don't even realize it. But if you look at the body from a place of calm, then it's astounding what you can see in terms of just getting a little distance from this sort of mantle of clay. And the irony is that when one does that, the mind becomes much brighter. Because you imagine what happens when the mind, this profound thing, really identifies with what is effectively a mass of blood, calcium, stone, flesh, hair, pus. Like, what would that do to the mind? So if you can just get it to step back a little bit by contemplating what this is really made of, then it automatically, the mind just becomes brighter of its own. And it's a huge source of happiness, especially if you're a greed type. So if you really like sweet things, you might be a greed type. If you get angry at people a lot, you're probably an anger type. And in that case, contemplating the body can make you much angrier. So you should be a little wary of it. And you won't notice it's such a powerful practice that sometimes the effects take a few days to manifest. So you might find the next morning that you're really angry. And then you should maybe lay off it a little bit and practice loving kindness. But if you're a greed type, then it's a very powerful practice. And the Kruba Ajahns, the great teachers of Thailand, really speak about if one can break through the body and break through that attachment, then it is the most, it's kind of the defining moment that brings a lot of people into initial awakening. It's so powerful. But one can also just contemplate other things in one's life. And with each of those things, whether it be a relationship or a mood or a way of acting, then yes, one can look at the impermanence of that thing, how it changes. And then one can look at, become dispassionate towards it when one sees how it's always shifting. And then, and dispassion in this case, viraga, literally means to lose color. It's like a plastic toy being left out in the sun until it fades, its color fades. And then when one is stopped being so intoxicated by it, then one can start seeing more clearly it's fading. We're always missing things disappearing because we're always looking towards things coming into being because it's more exciting. So we miss the thing, we miss half the story. We forget the death of a loved one for the birth of a new, child very soon, forgetting that they're part and parcel of the same story. And then one contemplates relinquishment, which is the sense of letting go. And Bhante Analayo gives a great analogy. It's like one is looking at cars passing on a road, and you see them come into view and then pass away. And this is contemplating impermanence. And then one becomes dispassionate towards that, but because they see them coming into being and passing away. And that's the turning of one's head slightly away, so that one just sees the cars passing away instead of coming into being. And one is focused on their cessation because that dispassion has happened. Or the dispassion happens, and then one contemplates cessation, which is one becomes more and more sensitive to their passing away, just focusing on this side of the story, which we've missed for our whole lives, really. And then that leads to relinquishment, which is a real letting go of that. So one can apply that to one's life, but also just as that third tetrad of the mind can be applied to any step within the Ānāpānasati sutta, this fourth tetrad can as well. So one can see how these objects of meditation in the first 8 steps or more, how they change. And then one becomes dispassionate towards them because they see how they are shifting in course. And then one sees they're fading away and relinquishes them and moves on to a more refined object. And one sees how, as you sort of progress up these steps, there is a movement from more impermanent to less impermanent. The breath coming in and out, it's very changeable. It's changing every second. But then you move to the field of awareness of the whole body, and it's much more stable. Or this sort of subtle sense of the breath energy flowing, and that's even more stable. And then the still field of awareness and pleasure that come from that, and that's even more stable. So in each stage, one contemplates the impermanence and lets go and moves on to a higher level of practice. Okay, I wanted to try to speak to all 16 steps there. I think we got through it. Well done, everyone. Good work. Good work. It was worth getting out of the way and trying to get through it. So I think now we have a chance just to talk, but it's an amazing sutta, and it's one worth memorizing because it's continued. I have a monk teacher who said that the way you honor these texts the most is by memorizing them. Because if you read them and take what you think they're saying out and just summarize, then you're assuming that you're equal to the text. You're assuming you've gotten what it had to give you. And time and again, I find with these texts, it's just not the case. There's so much encoded in them that you don't realize until you've contemplated it day after year. And this sutta, which overlays at least 3 others, is one of those texts that's just come back again and again. And yeah, it's well worth memorizing, I'd say. Of all the suttas, it's the one I think is the one that has helped me the most. So, yeah, best of luck. Okay. People want to discuss things that are coming up? If there's anyone online that has questions, I don't know if there is or not, but also welcome to ask them. But we don't have to turn it off quite yet, Dad. If they're not.
No, I wasn't seeing if there's any questions.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in on these 16 steps. Yeah.
I really don't know anything about Buddhism because I've never really been that interested. I'm interested in meditation and emptiness. And so this has just been such a wonderful teaching. And, I've heard you repeat it and say it, and I really got to hear it and feel it. And, gosh, it's just been incredible. It feels so beautiful, so dynamic.
Yeah, so just for those listening, yeah, Jeannie praised me and the talk and said that she'd been interested in meditating, but not so much in Buddhism. So it was really interesting to see these teachings laid out like this. And I found it too, you read the suttas and they sort of, sometimes they can come across as a little repetitive. You're like, okay, be good, don't kill things. And then you move on to a biography or something. And it's interesting when you begin to understand how much is in these and how they're not these strange, esoteric, random things. Like they map onto experience, and it's not just a arbitrary psychology. It's far, as far as I can tell, far more profound than most Western models I've ever encountered. And that's not even getting into the wheel of dependent origination, like the 12 links. My God, like if you want to talk about intense psychology, and this was 2,500 years ago, and I remember sitting in Bodh Gaya where the Buddha became enlightened. And if you haven't gone, you should go. It's like thousands of Tibetans doing full-length prostrations, 12 hours a day, like Tibetan grandmothers that put you to shame. Like, it's just, and then Burmese and every type of practitioner there together. I did not expect it to be so moved by so many people paying respects to the transcendent. And yes, in this case, that is referring to the Buddhist figure. But when I was there was this chant of the 12 links of dependent origination, which is supposedly kind of the way the Buddha initially articulated his awakening, and every previous Buddha And we won't get into that if you thought these 16 steps were intense. But it was so moving to see a psychology that deep brought there. And yeah, the Ānāpānasati sutta, the Mindfulness of Breathing sutta, it's really amazing. And little by little, I just find myself sort of lost in the woods of meditation, and then be like, oh my God, this is step. And then it would be like, oh, I have to do this, and it saved me again and again, So yeah, it's really astounding. I've been very moved by it.
Do you need to remake your copy? Yes. Okay, so right here. So it's a copy.
Eleanor asks, do you think you would be able to live a peaceful life as a lay person who has to make a living in this world? And by that I mean having a job, having to face all the things society pushes on us, advertising, violence, lust, etc. What would you suggest, or what would you struggle most with? What would be your suggestion for overcoming those difficulties? Small question.
Small question, my dad says. So, and Dad, you should be able to also tap it and make it display on the screen for those who didn't see. There may be a way of doing that that's worth learning as well. We're learning the technology. Yeah. Can you do that? And then tap it again to make it disappear after a little bit.
Just wants to put the user in timeout. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, and then make it disappear after a while. So to repeat the question, although I believe now it's just okay, so you can see it, and you can put it away after a little bit. Yeah, that's a really good question, and not one easily answered. My sense is that we all come into this life with different karma. And some people, I really think, not everyone's going to be a monastic. And I think some people are much better suited to the wider world in that way. And, I did live in the world as a practitioner for 9 years. I started meditating when I was 15, and then just moving through life and keeping practice part of my life. But also, and granted, that's not like having a family and stuff, but, high school sucks, there's plenty there. And for me, the difficulty was that, partly it was that I think my karma was to be a monastic. I always felt that burning in me, more and more and more as time went on. So something in me knew that this was the route I think I needed to go. And that's my personal karma. And I don't think everyone has that same inclination. So it's not to say everyone should be a monastic. For me, there's always the sense of doing good, but at an angle, like always approaching what I knew was right, but never quite right, and always kind of diluting myself because I didn't have the self-restraint to avoid the Netflix binge or to get stoned one more time. I didn't do a lot of things like that, but every now and again it happened, and it still left me feeling really bad and like I wasn't living a life worthy of my death. And for me, so much of the tragedy of modern life isn't real tragedy so much as a steady dilution of our purpose and hearts in a confluence of comfort and convenience. And that is not soul-crushing, but soul-fracturing, little by little by little. And so I think that for me, it really culminated when I was driving down the California coast looking into grad schools, and then I stepped and listening to Top 40 radio and reading The Hunger Games and stopping at Taco Bell, and then I just stepped into the monastery there, and I was like, oh my God, I need this, this silence in this container. So I would have a lot of trouble living as a lay person. I'm not, the container is very useful for me. And I think I would live a good life, an okay life. I think if I were, what I would recommend for people who are living that life and whose inclination or karma seems to be leaning that way is one thing being a monk has made me realize is how useful the props are, like the daily schedule, the precepts, the rules, having something to bow to, the costume. And you read the suttas, and there were unbelievably dedicated lay practitioners in the Buddha's time. And there's a pretty robust structure the Buddha laid down for them that we do not utilize as much as we could. So there's stories of these two ministers of King Pasenadi, who was a devotee of the Buddha. And they would always go to bed with their head facing towards where they thought the Buddha was. And, you know, in Thailand, you have these practitioners who come to the monastery once a week on the Uposatha day. And that's one of the great institutions which I think lay people don't utilize as much as they should, is this chance to set one day aside every week as a Sabbath and just devote it to practice. In Thailand, it's very standard for devoted Buddhists to take on eight precepts during that day. So they won't eat afternoon, just to make the mind and body light after afternoon so it can meditate better. And then they'll stay up all night at the monastery meditating together. And they'll spend all day at the monastery. And I think if one can somehow bring a Sabbath into one's week, that helps a lot. Making sure that one has retreat in one's year. The Buddha recommended 3 months. Not a full-on retreat, I'd say, for lay people, but in Thailand, it's standard for those 3 months for really devoted Buddhists to make more of an effort to go to the monastery and to usually take on some other ascetic practice or restraint, like stopping drinking during those 3 months. So really making use of that time. And then visiting the Sangha. You know, there are enlightened teachers now in North America, I think. I think I've met some of them. And if that's the case, then go to the monasteries. Like, how often in a lifetime do you have a chance to meet someone like that? So, yeah, I'd say that's all important. And really restraining use of media, especially news intake. Stay up to date enough to do what really needs to be done. But this sort of mantra of I want to stay informed is a very unexamined dynamic. Like, how many times do you have to check your iPhone's news feed to be informed, you know? And usually looking at, you know, a long form article or two once or twice a week is plenty, you know? So don't let your mind become sullied. Just ideas. Maybe we should call it good for now. No, either this or we can discuss as a group. But if you have a question for everyone, let's do it.
Yeah, I appreciate what you said about body contemplation and anger. And I guess I'm thinking of that as if you already have an aversion to kind of being on the planet, or you're like, I hate it here, this place sucks. And then you go into this contemplation of, ooh, I hate my body and I don't want to be in my body, then I can see how that would intensify that tendency. So for those of us who fall into that arena, which I do, I have my thoughts about what I think are supportive to kind of pull me towards a more like, yes, I want to be here. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that.
So the question was for, she appreciated, one of the audience members appreciated what I said about body contemplation and being a bit wary of that contemplation if you're an anger type. And if you already are falling into this sense of not wanting to be here in this world, then it seems like quite a dangerous contemplation in some ways and just could exacerbate that. So what would I recommend in terms of practice to bring one into a more healthy relationship with being in general and wanting to be here? Something like that? I mean, I think that, you know, first of all, it is, I think, yes, if one is an aversive type, then body contemplation can be a problem. But also, many people, and especially women, I think what our culture does to people's body image is unbelievably brutal. And I can't imagine, even as a man, I think that it's far more brutal for women in terms of that, and I think there's probably a great deal of self-hatred around body image for many women and men, but that actually, if one is a greed type and still leans that way, that actually this contemplation can still be helpful, because negative body image is comparing one's body to other bodies, and it's still somehow based in this deep attachment to body. Whereas what Asubha does, contemplation of the body just as a body, as an amalgamation of elements of bone, looking at the spinal column as just a bunch of stones, because that's all it is it makes you see through all bodies as these strange, sort of awkward, sort of endearing, but kind of gross things. Like it's just like, okay, and people start to shine through more. You see it as just this veil which covers the spirit. And if one has a really negative personal body image in the manner of that culture instills, then actually it can really help, because it's like, oh, everyone's kind of weird. It's like, and it's an equalizer. That being said, and one could really test this very clearly, like when one is calm and the mind rests in calm and then begins to move, then take a second, really direct it towards the body. Like the skeleton is a very powerful object for people. So looking at the skeleton, contemplating it, imagining the body decay, peel off the skin if you want. It can be kind of gross, but it's just real. It's just what it is. You can contemplate in kind of the gurgling of your stomach. It's just a bunch of stomach acid. It's this strange thing that we totally don't look at. Everything we see on the surface of the body is dead. It's all you see is any live skin would be far too painful. So the surface of the skin is dead. Even the eyes are dead. They only seem live because they're moist. So like these contemplations, they might sound interesting, but if you look at them with a calm mind, something in you can really see in its clear moments like, oh my God, it's just an arm, and it's a pretty profound insight, and it can lead to an amazing sense of brightness. But you'll feel very quickly what the effects are. And if it does have that negative aversive effect, then yeah, it's a problem. And there's a story of the Buddhist time of many monks committing, a whole group of monks committing suicide after they contemplated the body too harshly. And after that, the Buddha taught the Mindfulness of Breathing sutta. So there's your antidote, this is the paradox, is that simultaneously you're letting go of the body, but you're also gaining a deep relationship to it on an intimate, subtle level, which is what the Ānāpānasati sutta does, the Mindfulness of Breathing sutta. Is, yeah, you're seeing through the clay and the blood and this flesh and the hair, but you're also becoming aware of the subtle flow of energies and of these huge resources it has. And you're looking at it as this kind of weird friend that's been with you for a while, and it has something to give you. And yeah, the mind can become so bright through that practice. So it's sort of two sides of the same coin. And I'd say mindfulness of breathing is a good one. And metta. Loving kindness is so powerful, really. 10 minutes a day can change a life.
So somebody on the feed said, I have anorexia and I feel that the depth meditation and body parts meditation have been very helpful. And also seeing the body as nature, very helpful.
Thank you for sharing that. So just someone on the feed said that, did you highlight it? It's okay. Let's not. Yeah, so just that they have an eating disorder, and that contemplating the body has been very helpful for them, and contemplating the body parts. And thank you for sharing that. And yeah, my sympathies. I don't know that particular suffering as deeply as I think some do. And my sense also is, the Ajahn Panyavada, one of the great teachers in our tradition, he's an amazing biography called Uncommon Wisdom. We have it back there. And he says, we take almost 90% of our opinion of others from their body image. And it's true. I mean, whether you're, unattractive or being attractive would be brutal, because you don't know if people are always just judging you by that and wanting you for that. And And it's the beautiful thing with this seeing through the body is just that little step back. Not only does it attenuate every defilement and also the sense of self in this nitty-gritty way that like all sort of every high wisdom koan barely touches. I mean, it really gets at the deep place where we anchor our view of self. But yeah, soon it lets you see the spirit shine through people more, because you're just seeing through the veil. You know, I mean, it's just this veil that's fooled us for so long. But it doesn't get taught in the West because it's a lot more fun to talk about metta than about people's spleens. But it is useful to practice. Mm-hmm.
Really, this is just my wanting to tease out the. I mean, I think a lot of people see Asubha practice as almost creating an aversion to the body, and maybe you could talk about the difference between aversion and dispassion.
So my dad said that a lot of people think of Asubha as creating aversion to the body, and maybe speak to the difference between aversion and dispassion. Yeah. And that is sort of what I was aiming for with unhealthy body image, is comparing one's bodies to others. And the aversion that one might feel towards one's own body is actually a part of attachment. Whether you're holding something at arm's length or holding it close to your chest, both is holding. And what this does is, yeah, this sense of dispassion is just seeing all bodies as the same in terms of this sort of awkward critters that we kind of go around with, and they're kind of strange and a little gross, but you know, whatever. And they serve their function and they do their best, and they're unbelievably complex. So, but because we've been so attached for so long, then the contemplations do kind of take this opposite tactic and try to move us in the opposite direction so that we can come to a safe spot in the middle. So
I just want to say, I think that there's also caution for couples. That, you know, just to have some caution around that when you're in a couple, that you sort of have to have a little distance between the time you do some Asubha reflections, looking at your partner.
So someone in the audience is saying that one has to be a little bit cautious around maybe couples using Asubha practice, and having perhaps a bit of distance between the time you practice Asubha and when you're with your partner. And I remember I was in a monastery where a wife was getting really into Asubha, and she shaved her head, and her husband was like with her, and he was like totally baffled by the whole thing. And it was not a happy pairing, and he was not happy with the monks. So fair enough. At the same time, I feel, because it's almost never practiced, it's why I think it's okay to push a little more than people use it. And having it in your tool belt is very helpful. The unfettered sexual desire does such damage to relationships. How many unfaithful relationships, how much dissatisfaction. So just having something in your tool belt that you can use to just cool those fires a little is not a problem. And you don't have to worry too much about losing your sexual lust. Like, it'll come right back. You know, it's deep, and you are being hit from all sides with it. So just having something in your day to like cool it a little bit, it's healthy. And yeah, you might not want to do it right before date night, you know, fair enough. But I wouldn't worry too much. Maybe don't take it on hard, you know, too much, but if you're in a couple, but you can gauge as you go. Okay. Thanks for joining us.